But thank you all so much for joining us. Best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize finalist Eowyn Ivey will discuss her new novel, Black Woods, Blue Sky, a reimagination of sorts of Beauty and the Beast in this installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. So Eowyn was raised in Alaska and continues to live there with her husband and two daughters. She worked for nearly a decade as a bookseller at an independent bookstore, Fireside Books in Palmer, Alaska. And prior to that, she was a reporter for her local newspaper, the Frontiersman. She is the author of the prior novels, The Snow Child, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in fiction, as well as To the Bright Edge of the World. So let's give a big virtual round of applause to Eowyn for joining us here tonight. And Eowyn, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Robert, for inviting me. This is the miracle of technology now. I think one of the great things that did come out of COVID is our ability to do these kinds of things. And I think I saw on the chat already, there's someone here from Maryland, Myrtle Beach, Tacoma, Washington. What an amazing thing to get to be here. And a huge thanks to Massachusetts Library for doing this kind of event. What an amazing thing.
Thanks, Eowyn. So Eowyn, as we were talking before we started, I just finished your latest book, Black Woods, Blue Sky. I absolutely loved it, okay? And I have to be careful and avoid spoilers, but I will say that I got really emotional towards the end. That's all I'll say, okay? But I really, really enjoyed it. And so I was hoping we could just spend the first couple of minutes, if you just want to give a brief synopsis, a brief tease of what the book is about.
Yeah, so it tells the story of a single mother named Birdie. And it's set kind of in the, I would say, like late 1970s through to the early 90s in Alaska. So more modern than my other novels. And Birdie is working as a waitress at a roadside lodge. She has a 6-year-old little girl, Emaleen, and she's struggling, to be honest. She's trying to kind of find her way in the world, trying to figure out how to be happy while also being a responsible mother, maybe. And she meets this strange recluse, Arthur, who doesn't interact much with the society in that community, is a little bit of an oddball, and she becomes attracted to him and ends up moving out to his remote cabin on the other side of the Wolverine River. And that's kind of where the story takes off from.
Yeah, that seems like a good idea. so, Eowyn, can you talk a bit about how this book, and this was a big debate, big controversy on Goodreads. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
And I will say though, we are maintaining, we're pretty much at that magic 4.0. So we're feeling good about our Goodreads. But there are some folks. Can you talk a bit about how this book is a reimagination, or certainly inspired by Beauty and the Beast, and maybe can you talk about your own interest in that fairy tale?
Yeah, well, it's so funny that you bring that up because with my first two books, I would look at Goodreads quite often. I like to see what people were saying about the book. With this book, it became kind of painful to read some of the comments, and I was becoming a little obsessed with it. And my husband saved me because he said to me, "I bet you can't stay off of Goodreads for a month," and he bet me money. And it's kind of silly because it's all the same money, but I hate to lose a bet, and so I've actually tried to stay off of Goodreads because it's such a turmoil on there about whether this is Beauty and the Beast or not. But I will say personally, it was a huge inspiration for me as I was writing the book. I grew up loving these fairy tales like East of the Sun, West of the Moon, Beauty and the Beast, and Brown Bear of Norway, and other kinds of stories that tell of men who were also animals in different forms. And it just spoke to me on some level, I think, because of my own childhood growing up. And I eventually realized that it was sort of a pathway in for me to tell a story that I'd wanted to tell, kind of about my deepest fears during my childhood. And so, talking about it in terms of the Beauty and the Beast, the reason I originally mentioned it to my editor was because I felt like it was a huge inspiration for me and perhaps a pathway in for readers to understand and maybe interact with the book. But I think for other people that maybe it has been misleading in some way because this isn't your typical happily ever after romance. So I feel like we have to be a little bit cautious there in terms of how we project it out to readers.
Yeah, no, but I definitely see it as a reimagination of Beauty and the Beast. It's certainly there. Actually, though, I did want to ask you, and I asked you prior to our start, but how would you define this book? What is the genre of this book? And perhaps, and this might be a tough question for you, but could you suggest some read-alikes? You know, if you liked this type of book or these types of books or this series or this author, you should give this particular book a shot.
Yeah, it's difficult because, and it's funny because I did work as a bookseller for almost 10 years. And as a bookseller, I found it really useful to talk about things like genre and similar types of books, because it helps readers figure out, and I'm sure it's the same in a library, kind of guiding people to the kinds of books that they'll like. As a writer, though, I don't find I'm particularly, I'm not very good at writing to a genre, so to speak. And I think that people who have read my first two books can kind of know what I'm going to do. And I think it does have, usually there's at least one fantastical element that some people have referred to as magic realism. It's a term that I don't know. I think it's just a way to talk about the book in some sense, that there's going to be something that's going to require you to let go of reality a little bit, to kind of suspend disbelief a little bit. But at the same time, I'm very interested in writing about the natural world, and our relationship with it. So people like Annie Proulx, Louise Erdrich, Guterson's, Snow Falling on Cedars. These were all books that were really influential to me because they're about people living in an environment that are very much influenced by the community and the natural world around them. And that's a big inspiration for me.
Excellent, excellent. So I did want to talk about each of the three main characters, and you can tell us as much or as little as you'd like about each. I'll let you decide where the spoiler line is and not. But first, I wanted to talk about my least favorite character, and maybe it wasn't supposed to be this way, but I didn't love Birdie. And Eowyn, I am not a parent, I am not a guardian. So I don't typically judge other parents and guardians and grandparents and whatnot. But I do think it's safe to say that Birdie was, at least in my eyes, an irresponsible parent. Less so the alcohol and the drugs, but just I feel like in every crossroads in your story, she pretty much made the wrong decision every time. Just your thoughts on her in general, and what should the reader know about her, and can you talk about what you were trying to portray, and whether you think she is a good, quote unquote good or quote unquote bad mother.
Yeah, I find this such an interesting discussion. And it's funny because with each of my books, there were things I was nervous about how readers were going to respond to. And those were never the things that ended up being the problematic for people. I'm always a little bit surprised, to be honest. So you're not alone. There are many people who have frankly said, like, I couldn't like the book because I dislike Birdie so much. And that really surprised me. And I did have one really great podcaster who asked me, do you think if it would have been the father who was acting that way, would she be judged the same way? And at first I said, I just think that people are judgmental of parents in general, to be honest. I think we all do it. We all want parents to be good, to be good parents. But I do wonder if a little bit if women are held to a higher standard, and if when we read a book, we so much want a mother to be a good mother. Now, I would say about Birdie is that she's young and she doesn't have a lot of resources. And as I wrote about her, I was trying to write about a mother. I was very fortunate growing up. I had, in terms of my mom, a very great role model for how to be a good mom. And I had the privilege of having like money and resources. And now as a mother, a husband who is entirely supportive of me. So as a mom, you get tired of always being a mom. You need a break to be yourself at times. And I wondered about how would it be to not have those resources of someone saying, hey, you need a break or you need to do something different with your life. We're going to help you make this happen. So that was one of the things I was trying to explore. And I would say that while Birdie is certainly a dysfunctional person, I don't think you can doubt her love for Emaleen. I think she absolutely loves her daughter, and I think it's actually one of the reasons she makes that move out, right or wrong. She believes that it's going to provide a better life for her and her daughter, that she won't have to work as a night waitress and things like that. It was interesting too because last night I just did an event at our local bookstore in Anchorage, Tidal Wave Books, and one of the young women there said, "I just want you to know how much I really could relate to Birdie and
Mhm.
how much she wanted this other life." And I wanted to hug this young woman because I felt like, "Oh, you get." And she said, "I think as an Alaskan woman, I want this adventurous life. I want to go out and see the world." So I wonder sometimes maybe there's a cultural element to it of people who live in Alaska yearning for that, and maybe some people can relate to that more or less. I'm not sure.
Yeah. And when I'm evaluating characters, I'm coming at it with my bias of being a middle class, white cis guy, so you're right. If her character was a man or if I was a woman, I'm sure I'd see things
Hard to
differently.
know. Yeah, it's hard.
One thing to follow up with that though, one thing that I thought was really interesting was really she was at times, she loved her daughter and she wanted to be there for her daughter and provide for her daughter. But at the same time, she also wanted her own freedom and independence. And I imagine that is something that many mothers, especially younger mothers, struggle with that dynamic, that push and pull. Did you want to speak briefly to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very real, and like I said, I was just fortunate when, I was older than Birdie was when she had her daughter. And I was a little more established in a career. And like I said, I had this great husband. And so I had these feelings that Birdie has. And my husband would say, "Hey, I will take care of the girls. You go out on a hiking trip or a hunting trip by yourself." So I wondered what would it be like to not have that ability to do that. So I kind of put a small part of myself into Birdie in terms of that yearning for our own individuality that can kind of get sucked up or lost in that role of mother, I think. And I think it is something that's really common that women struggle with. But it is interesting to me that, and I think that's what I love about books, both reading them and writing them, is trying to project and understand people who are different than us. I feel like that's part of an interesting element. So Birdie, in ways, is very different from me, and I was trying to kind of empathize with that situation.
Now, my favorite character, who you referenced just now, was Emaleen, the daughter, the 6-year-old daughter. It just reminded me of what I think I was like when I was 6 years old in terms of chasing butterflies and interacting with nature and, being a big mouth, but at the same time keeping secrets and learning how to swim and having imaginary friends. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about Emaleen.
Well, that makes me so happy to hear. And I have to say, Emaleen is the closest to an autobiographical character that I've ever
Oh,
written.
good.
Yeah. So I really into her, I had imaginary friends. I loved storybooks as a child. I spent a lot of time by myself just because of where we lived when I was growing up. I spent a lot of time playing by myself and having little stories and made up things. But I also lived with a lot of fear just because of elements of my family life, and being in the natural world and understanding that things like bears were nearby. So I put a lot of myself into her. But I will say, like you say, I think I was like that when I was 6. But I was fortunate enough I have 2 daughters, and the youngest one at the time when I was really actively writing this book, she was working at a summer camp with 5 and 6 and 7-year olds. And it was perfect because I could have her read sections and I'd be like, "Hey, does this ring true?" And she could say like, "Hey, these are what I hear the kids talking about, the kind of words that they use, the way they tell their stories." So I tried to kind of integrate a lot of that in because it's been a long time since I was 6 years old too.
Yeah. And the mother bringing the child to work and I think my mother did the same thing when maybe not 6 but a little younger than that. So yeah, I could relate a lot to her some of her story arc.
Yeah.
And then the character that I have mixed feelings on, I think in the end I liked him, was Arthur. You want to talk a little bit about Arthur?
Yeah, and it's interesting because he's a main character, but he's one that we actually don't get to see inside of his head, right? So we don't really get to know him from the inside out. And he remains, in many ways, to the end, mysterious. And I don't think it's giving, you and I, Robert, and I talked about this before we started the webinar about how much to give away. And I don't think it's giving too much away to say that he's also a bear. And I think that, when you look at the cover, I love the illustration that I just love this cover that they did for me at Random House. And the shadow, there's a bear standing by a tree and there's a little girl, and then his shadow is that of a man. And it's funny because I think a lot of readers miss that, but it gives you a clue kind of where I'm going. And as we talk about things like Beauty and the Beast and the Brown Bear of Norway, we kind of also get an inkling of what that might be. And I think that I wanted him to remain somewhat mysterious to us because I think that's the truth of our relationship with wild animals. We don't really, we project ourselves onto them. We try to understand them. We underestimate them sometimes, I think. And I wanted to kind of leave that open a little bit for interpretation in terms of how well we get to know him as a man and as a bear.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about bears. So I'm curious, what sort of research did you do with writing this bear-centric story? Not just real life bears, but also bears in mythology as well.
Mhm.
So love to hear
Yeah,
your take on
I
that.
accumulated huge stacks of books, both about bears in terms of biology, and in terms of all the folk tales and fairy tales and things that interact with bears in different ways. And the truth is, growing up in Alaska, especially if you spend much time in the outdoors, you're inevitably going to interact with bears. And I have a million bear stories. But it was interesting because when I first wrote on an early draft of the book, this book took me a long time to write, and I went through lots of revising to try to get it right. And early on, I realized, coming from my editors and agent who live in London and Connecticut and New York and different places, they didn't have all the stories that I knew coming into it about bears. So early on in the book, I added a section where Birdie kind of talks about what it's like to be an Alaskan and to tell bear stories. That being said, even as much as I felt like I had interacted with bears and knew about them, I'm a stickler for wanting to get the details about the natural world right. And I ended up spending 2 weeks in a remote field camp on Kodiak Island, where the largest brown bears live. Our neighbors are brown bear guides, they're hunting guides. And I said, hey, can I tag along on one of these hunts? And so it was me and the two guides and a client, so three men and me in a four-man tent, basically, for 2 weeks with very big brown bears, in the vicinity constantly. And we spent much of our time just sitting up on the hillside, observing these bears interacting, and sows defending their cubs from boars, the bears fishing for salmon, trying to get a beaver out of a beaver house, just hours and hours of watching bears. And at first, I wasn't really sure how I was going to use all this research. I was taking lots of photos and notes, but then as I was writing, it began to kind of trickle into who Arthur is, both as a man and as a bear. So it ended up being just this invaluable experience and an incredible adventure.
So we touched on the three characters. By the way, you said that you have a million bear stories just now. Can you give us one of your best bear stories?
Well, probably the most frightening one where I really genuinely felt in danger was years ago. My husband and I were fly fishing on a creek. And creeks are dangerous because there's the roar of the water. So the bears can't hear you coming and can't hear them. And that's when a bear is most dangerous from everything I understand, or one of the most dangerous times is when they're startled. And we came out from the brush and there was a very, very large sow grizzly bear with three nearly full grown cubs that were just almost as big as her. And they all stood up. And then she dropped down to all fours and came charging across the creek at us. And you're not supposed to run from bears. It's the worst thing to do because it can kick in their chase instinct, and they'll want to make sure that you're really been knocked out as a danger. But I ran. I started running. It was like instinct. Luckily, my husband is much more calm in these situations, and he had a pistol, and he made the choice to shoot into the water in front of her rather than shooting at her. And it startled her. She flipped around, ran off into the brush with her three cubs, and we camped out on that creek that night. And I will tell you, I did not sleep well at all.
Oh, holy smokes! Uh, well, Eowyn, I'm glad you're here to
Yeah, me too.
talk to us. I mean, oh my goodness. So I did lie though earlier. I said your book has three main characters, but all your books have all your books have another main character, and that is Alaska. Okay, so
Yeah.
all your three books are set in Alaska. Can you talk? And I just loved your description of Alaska and the the scenery and the nature. Can you talk a bit about why you set your books in Alaska and why Alaska is so important to you?
It's just where I grew up. And so there's kind of an element. It's funny though, because growing up here, I didn't really because I had spent so much time here, I think we take for granted the things that we know too well, and they don't seem particularly interesting to you when you're like 14, 15 years old, you know? And so when I was younger and I thought about writing, I thought, well, what am I going to write about? Like it's so boring around here in this small town in Alaska. And I think it really took leaving. My husband and I went down, we were dating at the time, and we went down to Bellingham, Washington, to Western Washington University for our schooling. And it was leaving that allowed me to kind of get some distance and see Alaska and realize that it's not the same everywhere, that every place has something unique about it. And for the first time, I could see what was maybe interesting about Alaska and about the things that I had seen and lived through. And that was when I started to kind of think maybe I can write about this place. And I think what I love about it is that it continues to sort of refresh my sense of wonder. Every time I write a novel set here, I find that I have this increased awareness of whether it's the history or the flora or the fauna, because I want to get the details right. With this book, there's a lot of references to wildflowers. And as I was working on it, I spent so much time out hiking around and noticing these tiny little flowers that I kind of took for granted all these years. So that's been part of the really wonderful experience for me as a writer, is sort of realizing how much this place means to me and how complicated it is.
You had mentioned that it took you a while to write this book, and we don't have to go necessarily into all the personal details and whatnot. But why was that the case? And generally, how long does it take you to write a book?
I'm a very slow writer, I think, by most standards. I mean, certainly when you look at someone like a James Patterson or something, I'm a very, very slow writer. But this one took me longer than normal, and I'm very comfortable talking about it because it's a reality for us as writers that the rest, we would wish that we could just donate all the life we want to and all the time we want to our books. But other things happen in life. And as I was working on this book, it's a deeply personal book to me. I lived with a lot of fear in my household growing up. I love my father, but he was a terrifying person in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to write about that. And I was struggling with how to do it in a way that would be meaningful and honest and different. And then at the same time, as I was working on this book, like all of us, we went through COVID, which was that threw us all for a loop. And suddenly I had my whole family, as much as I love them, my husband and two daughters were all in the house together, and I was trying to write. And then unfortunately, a very hard thing was happening at the same time. Both my parents, who were divorced, separately developed cancer. And I was, in each of their cases, I was their primary caregiver. So as I was trying to write and sort of process elements of my childhood, I was also dealing with their decline and ultimate death. They both passed away within a few years of each other. And it was really hard, but I will say that it allowed me, once they were gone, there was a sort of peace that came about with that. And I was able to write the book a little more honestly, I think, because of that. I wasn't worried about hurting them in some way. And so I guess my lesson sort of for writers out there, for me anyways, as a writer, was that sometimes we just have to give the books the time that they need. Sometimes we're not ready to tell the story that's in them, or circumstances are going to work against us. But it'll eventually come as time comes, I think.
We touched on the main characters, wondering if you wanted to speak to any of the sort of supporting characters. We don't have to go one by one, but I don't know if there was one that you in particular enjoyed writing for, whether it was the father or the diner owner or whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I always, in each of my books, there's been some sort of side characters that I feel like have come to my rescue, in the sense of they're the kind of the fun. I tend to be a little bit serious in my fiction writing, and I have these sort of lighthearted characters. So we've got Sid, who is very, very intelligent, very well read, and also a big pot smoker, a very talkative person. And I love him because he's so many things that I grew up around as a kid, and even aspects of my dad. My dad was a big reader, and so there's parts of him that I love. And then Della, like you say, the owner of the lodge, is very big-hearted, very strong woman who tries to kind of make everyone's lives a little bit better. But I think the character that was most interesting to me, as far as kind of not the three main characters, is Warren. So he's the father of Arthur, and he's one of these rare cases. I've heard writers say this happens. I rarely have it happen. But when I first started writing in Warren's voice, it just came to me whole, like he was a living, breathing being from the beginning I started writing him. And it was more like I was channeling someone, which I know sounds strange, but I loved him. I feel like he was a very grounded, caring person who was struggling with a very morally difficult situation. And as a parent and as a just a decent man, I really sympathized with him and enjoyed writing his character a lot.
Yeah. Good. Yes, I agree with that answer. I enjoyed all three of those side characters actually.
Oh, thank you.
Um, wondering, and again, this could be spoilerish, so you might not want to give us an answer. But and I'm sure some people on the call have read the book, and some people on the call haven't read the book yet. But can you tell us, in the editing process, any key elements to the story that you, for whatever reason, changed? Where maybe in an original draft, a key component of the story is much different than the final version. Can you
So
lift the hood, so to speak?
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I always kind of knew the trajectory of the book. Like, I knew some of the big key plot points, which we won't name, I knew were going to happen. But I will say, I think probably the thing that I struggled with most, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, was Emeleen's voice, figuring out at what age to enter her life and what her voice was going to be like. And I did not have her 6-year-old voice for a long time. So I wrote a lot of the book and that piece wasn't there. And my editors and my agent kept saying, something's missing here. Like it's just not quite working. And I really trust their judgment. And unfortunately, they're really great at identifying when something's not working, but they usually can't give me the answer on how to fix it. I have to figure that out. And that's how it maintains my connection. It's still my story. And I realized I started saying, okay, what if I just step into those shoes? And I think part of it was a little bit of fear. I mean, it's hard to enter back into difficult childhood memories. And I was hesitant, and I think I kept kind of circling around it. And then finally, I just put myself back into those 6-year-old boots, so to speak. And so, as hard as it was to write, for me, that was the most rewarding writing that I ended up doing. And that's often the case, that the hardest stuff is often, for me, the most important stuff, I think.
And so we glossed over it a bit when I introduced you, but I know that you worked for many years as a journalist and then many years as a bookseller. Can you tell us the Eowyn origin story? How did you become a writer?
I think I just always, both from my dad and my mom, I just grew up that it was sort of a given that books would always be a part of my life. So my dad was had a degree in English literature, but worked as a carpenter and a builder and a designer, house designer. And my mom worked as an electrician accountant, like an accountant at our electric company, but she was a poet and had a published book of poetry. And whenever throughout my childhood, I always remember, so I've been with my husband. We started dating when I was 14, which I know is ridiculous. We've been together a long time, but I remember him coming over to the house when we were teenagers, and everyone always had a book out. Like, so the TV could be on, we could be eating dinner, and someone would be reading a book. And so he would say, like, God, it's like a library in here. So it was just always like it was assumed that it was going to be a part of my life. I grew up with it, but I didn't know how I was going to, like, I needed to find a way to earn a living, basically. And so that was the journalism component, and the bookseller component was figuring out how can I earn my keep, so to speak, while still being surrounded by the books that I love.
Yeah, and my understanding is now you have some sort of book shack that you write in.
I
Can
do.
you talk a bit about your book shack?
Yeah, and it goes back to that difficult time of trying to write when there was just a lot on my shoulders, both emotionally and just demands on my time. And I was struggling trying to get into the writing headspace, sort of. And when we first bought the property that we're on, there was a tree house that someone had built years and years ago. And my husband had lowered it to the ground and turned it into a playhouse for our kids. Well, our kids are all grown now. Our oldest is 25, our youngest is 18. It had just been kind of sitting empty. And it's probably, gosh, maybe 6 by 8. I mean, 8 by 10, maybe. It's a very small space. And I got this idea, and it's just, it's visible from the house, but it's a little bit of a walk up the hill. And I thought maybe if I just get to a different space that will help. So my husband helped me fix it up. I put a little wood stove in it. So even in the depths of winter, that was mostly when I was writing a lot, was in the wintertime. I would go up there, hike up the hill, start a little fire in the wood stove. And it just, there was something about that leaving my regular life behind became sort of a metaphor that allowed me, I think, to enter in. And I would pretend that I didn't have Wi-Fi, that I had no cell reception. I had no electricity up there, but it was all good. I didn't get distracted by the regular life, I think, as much. And it was really helpful to me. It really helped a lot. I know other writers have done this many, many times throughout history, really. Writers have found these little ways to escape their regular life.
So can you talk a bit about the success of your very first book, The Snow Child? I mean, I imagine that was a life-changing experience for you. It was so successful, both it was a bestseller, a commercial success, sold over, and I may be shortchanging you, but it sold over 1 million copies. And then it received a lot of critical acclaim, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Can you talk a bit about, you, having such an amazing amount of success for your very first novel?
Yeah, it was crazy because I feel like I had reasonable expectations. Having worked at a bookstore for almost 10 years, like I knew how hard it was to get published. And I knew how many great books do get published that just get ignored. Like that happens. We see that all the time that we know there's some little book that we just love that no one else has heard of. So I figured the chances of me getting published were very small. And my hope was that maybe I would find a regional publisher, at least get it into Pacific Northwest bookstores or Alaska bookstores. So yeah, the trajectory that happened with The Snow Child was completely insane. And it just feels like those 2 years where, suddenly my husband and I were flying to New York City, going to Australia on book tour, going to Paris. I mean, it was just
It got
insane.
turned into an opera, into a musical.
Yeah, it has said such a life beyond what I thought it would or what I thought I was creating. And it's funny because I had a lot of people say when To the Bright Edge of the World was coming out, say, well, are you nervous then? Like you've set this high bar. But it was really the opposite because I kind of felt like, well, like I've broken out into the literary world, like beyond any expectation. So now it doesn't really matter. Like I can write and have fun. And so with To the Bright Edge of the World, I felt braver, I think, and excited to try new things with voice and all that. That being said, and I've said this before, I have been much more nervous with the new book. And I think it's with Blackwood's Blue Sky, and I think it's just because it's so deeply personal to me. I was surprised by my own nervousness as it was getting ready to come out, sort of a certain anxiety of wanting people to understand what I was doing and connect with it. So yeah, it's been an amazing ride, and I never would have thought I'd be here now.
Well, and your new book, let's not sell that short. It's a bestseller.
Yeah.
Also receiving critical acclaim. Got several star reviews in
Yeah.
in library publications. I mentioned the 4.0 rating on Goodreads. It's a 4.5 on Amazon, folks. Okay, and it's on all sorts of lists, and it's going to do great, and it has
Always.
done great. I know it's been out for a couple of months, and
Yeah.
I'm sure more critical acclaim is coming with when those end of the year lists and awards and short lists and whatnot are announced. Okay. So we have a writing group here in Tewksbury, and I'm sure several of the other libraries who are participating also have writing groups. What advice would you give to an aspiring author?
I think it's one that we hear all the time and it's hard to really take to heart, but the idea that rejection is part of the process. It's so hard. It really is. And I think that as writers, when we have books come out, we're talking about a book that's been published and we're hopefully cheering it along and all that. But along the way, inevitably, for every single writer, there are rejections. And I think to know that, my agent had such great advice for me when he was first taking out The Snow Child to publishers, it was getting rejected. And I think, he recognized that part of the problem, it was during that recession period of like 2008, 2009. And he said, I think we just need to sit on it for a year. And I thought, wait a minute. I thought once you got an agent, the rejection was over, right? You're going to get published. You're on to the next phase. And it was heartbreaking. But I took his advice and eventually got up the courage to start working on something else, which was To the Bright Edge of the World. And I think that's the best advice. And I've heard other people say this too. If you're a short story writer, a poet, when you submit something, immediately start working on something new because then you're putting the focus. It's easy to get fixated, for me anyways. It's easy to get fixated on the failure or success of what I've put out there, and trying to remember that really the joy for me is in the writing process. So to keep writing, even in the face of rejection, try to take in the criticism that you think might make you better, and ignore the rest and just keep going.
So, folks, we're going to get to audience questions in about 5 minutes. I think we have already about 5 audience questions in the queue. If you have a question, please get it into the Q&A box. We'll get started on that in about 5 minutes. Eowyn, I have a fun question for you. I just
Oh,
feel like I
great.
have to ask it, and
Okay.
I'm going to ask it now in the middle of the conversation. Eowyn, who is your favorite Lord of the Rings character?
Well, I have to say, being married to a Sam, it's Samwise Gamgee, right? I mean,
Oh
it's
no!
and that's from The Hobbit more. I'm actually more of a Hobbit fan, which is crazy because my name, of course, is from The Lord of the Rings. I think what happened is I tried to read The Lord of the Rings when I was too young because I knew my name was in it, and I remember thinking, "Oh my gosh, this is the most boring book I've ever read in my life." I was probably 10, 11 years old. Now I have a new appreciation for it, and there's many things, and I'm glad that I'm named after Eowyn. And I'll never forget when the movies first came out, my mom was really annoyed because she said, the movies make Eowyn seem like kind of a, teary, whiny person, and she's not like that in the books at all. And I was almost an Arwen, but I'm glad I was an Eowyn.
Oh, there you go. All right. So a couple more questions for me. I'm wondering, you touched on it a little bit, but I do have to legally ask, are you a plotter or are you a pantser? It sounded like that you do know you do plan out some of your key scenes, but
Yeah.
how would you describe yourself?
It's so funny because I remember, I wasn't like, I hadn't gone through an MFA program. I wasn't super involved in the writing community starting off. And when The Snow Child came out, I remember the first time when I got asked that, and I was like, what does that mean, plots or pantser? I had no idea what it meant. Now I know what it means. And, I feel like it's a little bit of a hybrid for me. I need some kind of structure going in, or I find the blank page really intimidating. And so, oftentimes, in each one, there's been sort of a framework that I've started with. The Snow Child, it was a fairy tale. With To the Bright Edge of the World, it was a real life expedition. With this one, it was both my own personal experiences in life and the fairy tales of Beauty and the Beast and things like that. So those kind of give me something to work off of. And I usually have a trajectory, like I have an outline, I have an idea of where it's going, but I also try to be open to things change, and I might shift things around. Characters reveal themselves to me in different ways. So things are constantly shifting. But I do like to have something kind of to start with a little bit.
Sure. All right, so we are going to get to audience questions. We're at the 40-minute mark, so let's do that. All right, so Joan wants to know, what was the most difficult part about writing this book?
Yeah, I think that probably it was kind of acquainting myself with the very deep fears that I had as a child. I think that was the most difficult part of it. We live with the things that we go through in our lives, but I think most of us get to a point where we kind of set them aside and say, okay, it's time to move on and think about different things. And it was hard to kind of re-enter that experience and to see myself, to think back on myself as the little girl that I was. I think as kids, we can take on a lot of responsibility and feel more grown up than we are. But when I look at my daughters and think of them when they were 6 years old, I realize, just how fragile and young they are. So I think it was painful in ways to see that young me and know what she was fearing and what she was going through. So that was one hard thing. And I think that therefore made it difficult for me to figure out how to tell the story, how to just physically craft wise tell the story. And that was a difficult part. And every time I go through a lot of revisions working with my editors, and it's always hard when I share it and they say, hey, we love this and we love this, but it's not working. And I think, oh no. And that's always a heartbreak, but it pushes me to make my work better, I think. And so then I end up being grateful for it ultimately.
You've mentioned your daughters a few times. I'm curious, do your daughters do any sort of writing? Are they writers or
It's funny because they both at some time during their adolescence were writing for fun. And I think it's just maybe seeing me do it or just their own interest in books and reading. But no, interestingly enough, our oldest daughter lives in Montreal and she is in opera, the opera world. She has her degree in opera performance
Oh,
and is now working towards opera directing. And our youngest daughter loves math and is going to study math and wants to be a math teacher, is taking her second year of calculus in her senior year. So they're often, yeah, it's crazy. She got that from my husband's side of the family.
um, now, you're a very accomplished author. You wrote one of the best books of the year back in 2012. So I'm embarrassed to even ask this, but as I said to you before we went live, my only knowledge of Alaska comes from like pop culture. Like when I was younger, I would watch the reruns of Northern Exposure. Okay, and
Great.
I think I've seen a few other movies or whatnot that was set in Alaska. And of course, I know of some of your politicians on both sides of the aisle. But aside, I don't really know much about Alaska or what it's like to live in
Yeah.
Alaska, like on a day-to-day basis. First, let me ask you about the book. Let me go back to the book real quick before I
Yeah.
ask what I was going to ask.
Okay.
So, do people like Arthur actually exist in Alaska, where they kind of are recluse and they live in the woods, and you have to take a plane to visit them, and there's no running water? Is that a thing in Alaska?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where the this experience of Birdie taking her daughter and moving out to this cabin, to me, and I think to most Alaskans, does not seem at all outlandish. This happens all the time in Alaska, and there's a lot of really interesting, um, kind people. There are dangerous people that live this way. There's all kinds of people that live these remote ways in Alaska. So it's something that's very familiar to us. And I guess that you don't always realize how different your lifestyle is or how other people have experienced or known people. So yes, this is very common. And it was one thing I loved about being a newspaper reporter is often I was sent out to do stories driving down some little dirt road, occasionally getting flown out to some place to interview someone, and just these people that have these amazing lives, that have decided to, for whatever reason, kind of remove themselves from society. And it is a really interesting thing that is very prevalent in Alaska, absolutely.
Eowyn, a few years ago on ABC, like literally like 2 or 3 years ago, actually, Hillary Swank was in a TV series called Alaska Daily. Her
Yeah,
main and she was a journalist.
yes, right.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. I caught a few episodes, but
Yeah,
I do remember her. I do recall her having to travel by airplane to interview people. Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so I know nothing about Alaska. I'm very ignorant, I admit. So I don't even know if this question is accurate or not. But Eileen asks, how are you preparing for the imminent eruption of Mount Spur?
No, this is actually a great question. So Mount Spur is a volcano near Anchorage that appears to be getting ready to go off to erupt. And it happened, and I wish I should know this offhand. It happened years ago. I was I think a teenager, maybe college age when it happened. And I remember when it happened, we actually collected some of the ash in a little vial because there was like maybe a half inch of volcanic dust over everything. So it is a thing. I'm actually not too worried about it, except for the fact two things I'm worried about. One is that we are getting honeybees in the spring. We do beehives, and we've tried to overwinter them and haven't successfully done it yet. So we're getting our new bees here in a couple weeks. We're a little bit worried about them because the volcanic dust won't be good for them. So that's one worry that we have. And then the other is air travel. So I'm traveling a lot for the book, and I'm just hoping that I don't have any issues when the time comes, because they usually have to shut down the airport for a day or two when this happens. So yeah, it is everybody's watching it right now. There's pilots kind of flying around the rim to see if they can tell when it's going to go, and yeah, we'll see what happens. Great
Oh my,
question though.
oh my goodness, volcanoes in Alaska. Holy smokes. So Karen has a very specific question.
Yeah.
We touched a bit on your writing method, but Karen wants to know: do you actually use a computer, or are we writing on pieces of paper?
So I am almost exclusively writing on a laptop. And I think it's just because I have terrible handwriting and I get impatient with how slowly I write when I'm writing by hand. I know a lot of writers, especially writers that didn't grow up with computers, who will write everything freehand first and then type it in. But I am definitely I'm a huge fan of Word. The Word, for me, I know there's a lot of newfangled ways of writing now, different programs you can use. I use just basic Word. I love being able to move things around, save different versions of it. I just can type so much faster than I can write by hand. So that's my preferred method.
Joan stole one of my questions. Joan asks, can you give us an idea of what your next book will be about? And Eowyn, earlier for the advice to writers, you had said once you publish, start writing your next book. So what are we writing now?
Well, it's funny that you point out that I had that advice because I don't follow my own advice.
Oh,
I did, excuse me, I did with the Snow Child. When my agent said, "Stop worrying about the Snow Child, write your next book," I did eventually start. The truth is that each book, when I'm done, I feel like I have put every ounce of myself into that book and I have nothing left. I really feel that way. I just feel like I have no new ideas, no energy. And so it takes me a long time. And each time I have said at some point, I don't think I ever want to do that again. I find it a very challenging process. And at times it's disheartening, if you get a bad review or you get somebody who doesn't understand the book the way you hoped, it can be a little bit dashing to the spirits. And I go through this time of like, do I want to put myself out there again? Do I want to? It's a very vulnerable position to be in, especially when you're writing things that are close to your heart. But I will say that inevitably my brain starts to kind of play around with story ideas. So my family is betting that fairly certain I'll start working on something new. Not yet, but maybe someday.
and Eowyn. So last call for questions, folks. We'll start to wind things down here. Eowyn, so I'm usually the behind the scenes guy. Was there anything I should have asked you that I didn't ask you? Anything you want to bring up for the audience you think that they should know about your book that we haven't covered yet? Here's your time.
Well, I'll just say two things. There's a few places, kind of like organizations, I want to give a shout out to. One is libraries. I just feel really strongly that libraries are going through a difficult time right now. I'm not telling anybody anything new there. In Alaska, especially, there's been a lot of kind of attacks on libraries. Libraries have been such a huge part of my life as a reader and as a writer. So I'm grateful for libraries. I'm grateful for independent bookstores. I feel like any way that we can continue to support these things, I just want to give a shout out to those, both those groups they really support the literary arts in ways that no other organizations can, both libraries and bookstores. And then I want to give a shout out to the Kachemak Bay Writers Conference. So this is where I met my agent back in 2008, I think it was. It's a great writing conference up here in Alaska, but really there's great writing conferences happening all around the country. If you do a little research, if you're interested in writing, take the chance to go to one of these things and share what you're working on with an editor or an agent. You never know what's going to happen with it. And so I just encourage people to do those kinds of things if they're interested in eventually publishing.
Excellent. And so, Eowyn, where can folks who are watching live and watching in person and watching virtually and watching the recording, where can folks learn more about you and keep up to date with your work?
Yep, I try to be up with the times. I try. So I do have a website, and you're welcome to visit that. And it's got some contact information on there. But I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. I try to post events that I'm doing, but also little pictures from my life adventures I go on. And you can always reach out to me on those platforms too.
All right, so I think we'll wrap it there, folks. Let's give Eowyn a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. For those watching live, please take the feedback survey when you exit the Zoom and look for the recording via email later tonight. So Eowyn, thank you so much. I'm really glad I read your book. It was wonderful, and I absolutely have to go back now and read your first two books. It's going to happen.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Robert.
They're going to be in my to be read pile. So thank you all so much, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again, Eowyn, and stay safe with that volcano.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night.